My name is Rich Whitworth, Content Director of The Ophthalmologist. Welcome to this interview series ahead of this year's ESCRS in partnership with Teleon Surgical. I'm joined today by Professor Oliver Findl. Oliver, thank you so much for joining us. First of all, perhaps you can introduce yourself, your own research and the wider work of your research centre, please.
Okay, so I'm Oliver Findl. I'm based in Vienna, Austria. I'm at the Hanusch Krankenhaus, which is a mid-sized hospital with the Department of Ophthalmology. And we also have a research institute called VIRUS, Vienna Institute for Research in Ocular Surgery. Exists since about 13 years now, 14 years. And we do really clinical research, mostly in the field of cataract surgery, not only, but also some glaucoma, some medical retina, some vitreoretinal surgery. But our focus is really cataract surgery. That's presbyopia correcting IOLs, toric IOLs, prototyping, the whole range, sponsored trials, non-sponsored trials, all kinds.
Now, I know you've achieved a lot in your career, but can you share any professional highlights over that time?
For my career? Highlights. Well, I'm obviously a surgeon. I feel myself, being an anterior segment surgeon. I actually also do vitreoretinal surgery, and also corneal surgery. So I sort of have three fields which I feel, my heart feels close to, let me say it that way. And I actually enjoy that, having not only one subspecialty, because I think, there's some countries where you really only have one subspecialty you specialize in, which has its pros. But I also like to have a slight, sort of amazing distribution. Highlights, I think, I went right after medical school. I hadn't really done any research during medical school because wasn't part of our curriculum at the time. I went to Boston for a year, to Children's Hospital. So essentially, the Harvard hospitals, and did research there for a year on rats in the dark, in the dark room, which is actually really, I learned a lot. I'm not doing any more electrophysiology since then, but that's what I sort of started to get into the field. And that was a highlight because I learned a lot about how to do research, what's important, and so forth. And writing the first papers. I remember when I got the papers back, they were full of red pen. And it was just, that was probably not the single word which was left over. And then I did my training in Vienna. And then, after my training, I was still attending and did my associate professorship in Vienna. And I think, I had a very strong association with the Institute of Medical Physics at the time. And so when optical biometry was actually born in Vienna, so, the IOL master came out much later, but we had the prototypes. And so I was the person, the clinical, let me say, part, the ophthalmological part, who was part of these first measurements in human eyes with optical biometry. And that was a very fascinating, sort of time. And then I think 6 years later, the IOL master came to market, right, with that technology. And that was sort of quite amazing to be part of these studies. And, obviously biometry was always a big part of my research since then. And then I went to Moorfields Eye Hospital, 2006 to 2009 to be a consultant for the cataract service. And that was also something which I really enjoyed, to be somewhere else, in a different environment, a very interesting environment, and develop, my field. And then of course, ESCRS has been a big part of me. So I was voted into the council, I don't know, a long time ago. I was council member for 8 years, so I was re-voted once, and then I became secretary, and I was secretary for 8 years, always re-voted every second year, and then I became president-elect, and I'm president, and will be past president next year. So I have a long-standing history with ESCRS, and that is sort of, let me say, the Congress or the society which is closest to my heart. And then, there's other things, but I think these are sort of, three other things which I think were sort of important in my career development. Let me say it that way.
Okay, let's turn our attention to refractive cataract surgery. What are some of the biggest changes you've seen over the last decade?
The past decade? Well, I think the enhancement of biometry and IOL power calculation was a big enhancement, because that really only makes sense to use presbyopia correcting lenses if you're pretty close to target, right? To emmetropia in this case. So I think that's something which was really big help. And then for me, really this sort of arena of what they're called, EDOF lenses, enhanced depth of focus lenses, is the one which is most interesting. I was never a really big believer in bifocal or even trifocal technology. I've used it, of course, and it works, no question. But I've seen many of the, the sort of trade-offs or the compromises, and I personally would not want to have that kind of lens. So I always I struggle slightly with having a patient in front of me who wants that lens and to really become enthusiastic. Although there are some patients who do very well, and if you select them well, it works well. But I think the EDOF lenses would be something I could even imagine having for myself. And being an ophthalmologist, you're usually also a perfectionist. So I am a perfectionist, which is not always a good thing. By far not. Actually can cause a lot of issues for yourself psychologically, let me say it that way. But really, I want to have very crisp and very, high contrast and very good quality vision. And that's why I think now, I used to do a lot of monovision as well, and combining slight monovision with this sort of EDOF technology and finding that sweet spot for every single patient, which is slightly different for most patients because they have different, some are myopic before, some are hypermetropic before, they have different eyes, or they also have, of course, different, hobbies and needs. And so that for me is actually quite an interesting field to find that, obviously, trying to customize that best solution for the patient. And for me at the moment, that is really some type of EDOF lens or monofocal plus combined with some monovision.
Thanks so much, Oliver. You touched upon both EDOF and monofocal IOLs there. Could you tell me a little bit about your views on the performance of each, please?
Yeah, I think the problem is it's very difficult to put a line between those. It's one continuum. So you have monofocal lenses on the one hand, you have bifocal, trifocal, diffractive lenses on the very other end, right? Typically trifocal today. And in between you have monofocal plus, and then you have the EDOF, and then you have sort of diffractive EDOF lenses and, whatever. And so I don't think we can put a line somewhere and say that's right and left. That's sort of the monofocal plus, that's the EDOF. We like to put things in drawers, right? To have them in categories, which is fine. But I'm not really sure that makes sense, because the EDOF then there's diffractive, there's refractive EDOFs. They're very different styles, very different. Some play just with asphericity. Some actually have different curvatures on the surface. Some have rings, diffractive rings. So from that perspective, I don't think we should get hung up about that nomenclature. Even though I understand regulators and also concerning this reimbursement, obviously you would like to have very clear categories, but I think from our perspective, for me as a surgeon or as a doctor, I would rather just find the best solution for the person, whether it's a monofocal plus with some EDOF sort of elements, or whether it's an EDOF which is really actually nearly like a monofocal plus. And then the companies also play all games with us, right? They tell us all these things, and so there's a lot of marketing involved, and I don't really want to get into that too much. So I think from my perspective, and obviously you can't use all lenses. You can do some studies with this and studies with that. That's what we've done. And then now essentially, it boils down to 3-4 types of lenses which you like to use. And then maybe you'll discontinue one and you'll start another one, but you can't do them all, I think, because then you just lose oversight. And then you also need some experience with the lens. You need to actually have used it for a certain time, get the feedback from the patients, of course, also read the trials, read the studies, hear from colleagues. That's why, ESCRS, for example, as a congress is great, because you can get exactly that information. But I think at the end of the day, you still need to do it yourself. And you should ideally just have a few products you're using at the same time to really be able to be comfortable with them.
Thanks so much, Oliver. Final question, let's turn our attention to the future. What advances would you like to see in the EDOF IOLs and indeed multifocal IOLs in the future?
Yeah, I think we're still looking for that sweet spot. And I think what would be good is if we knew what the sweet spot was of each of these lenses. So let's say you have a slight, a weak EDOF lens, a weak EDOF lens. Not meaning having very little dysphotopsia, having very little of the side effects, but on the other hand, also having not such a strong effect, right? Because it's always a trade-off at the end of the day. You can't get, great vision in many distances without having a trade-off, meaning you're selling, and I always tell the patients, you can't trick physics. You can't make out of 100% light, 300% light for a trifocal. It's not going to work. Of course it can. And they know that and they understand that. And actually you lose some light to higher order diffraction or whatever it may be. So I think we need to find, so ideally what we would have is we'd have different lenses and we'd have a very good understanding of what they can achieve, but also what the limits are. And then if we have that, actually really use them selectively and properly for the patients, sort of, let me say, fine-tuned to their needs. And I think maybe at some point we'll have a situation where we could have a situation where this patient would need this. I mean, that would be something of the future. And I actually would have a custom-made lens for that patient because it has a very special need. That would be interesting. And I think that's obviously, far ways to go, and it's probably going to be very expensive and quite cumbersome and logistically. But on the other hand, the companies are, as these lenses are made in a very with machines, which are essentially you program them, and you could program the machine slightly differently and get a different lens, and not hugely different, but just a little different. And I could imagine sort of custom-made lenses at some point for some patients who have high needs or high wishes. Could be something which I can imagine could happen. Just a small segment, maybe just a few % of the patients. The real premium lenses would maybe be custom-made lenses. And maybe at some day we can actually, sort of get a lens and then actually just do the refining in the operating theater. That would be interesting with some kind of, special machine or printer. I don't know. Just thinking out loud. But, but I think this idea of having custom-made is interesting. Don't know what's ever going to happen, but would be fascinating.
Thanks so much for joining me today, Oliver. Really appreciate your time. Thank you for watching. We hope to see you all at ESCRS.